What's up, everybody? This is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And today I'm going to be bringing you a video response to my man Darius 19R's video on Yu Yu Hakushou being underrated. And as you can see, I'm wearing the specs again, and this time I'm wearing them because got to take you guys to school. I'm going to be throwing out some lists of what I think are classic anime. Some of them might not even be that good, but they are important, either one, because they're so influential to the origins and to shaping the modern shonen genre, and also because they help to carve out a sort of niche or a sort of subgenre within the shonen genre. So yeah, let's get into this video response to whether or not Yu Yu Hakusho is underrated. So the first thing that I have to talk about is whether or not Yu Yu Hakusho is actually an underrated anime. I think that for most people who are knowledgeable about anime, and who are knowledgeable about the more older anime and manga, the more classic anime and manga, they tend to have it's really split actually. Some of them tend to view Yu Yu Hakusho as really good, as great, as amazing. As some of us like myself, and I know Uber Black Man does this as well. He actually thinks that, in some respects, Yu Yu Hakusho is even better than Dragon Ball Z. But then there is a sort of split with other people who think that Yu Yu Hakusho is, it's a good anime, but they don't tend to recognize it as classic, and I think they do tend to underrate it. And you can clearly see this within the YouTube anime community. Like I just saw like the other day that Double Four Anime, for example, has never seen Yu Yu Hakusho. I know some other people hadn't seen Yu Yu Hakusho until very recently. People like the Insane Game Freak. If you remember, like a couple of months ago, he was, just watching Yu Yu Hakusho. So I know, sometimes people, rate it as among the classics. Sometimes people underrate it, and sometimes, people don't even, watch it at all. Um, Most of the criticism behind Yu Yu Hakusho, and this is what sort of leads to Yu Yu Hakusho being underrated. Most of the criticism breaks down into like three main parts. The first is that it's too redundant because of all the tournament style arcs that happen in Yu Yu Hakusho. I think there's like three. The first is with the Genkai sort of tournament where Yusuke fights Rando. The second is the Dark Tournament saga, of course, and then the third is with the saga of the Three Kings, how that sort of ends with another tournament. The second criticism of Yu Yu Hakusho, which leads to it being sort of underrated, is that the ending was a little bit rushed. And for those of you who know about Yu Yu Hakusho, you can see that it's kind of on the short side for a shonen manga, especially in relation to what we've been accustomed to reading in terms of the actual amount of volumes. Um, Now we live in the age of the super manga where it's expected that the manga will go at least 25, 30 volumes. But Yu Yu Hakusho is actually on the short side. It's only 19 volumes. And the ending does feel a little bit rushed because it abruptly ends with that sort of tournament style conclusion to the saga of the Three Kings. And the third criticism, which is I sort of been hearing recently, is that Keiko is not very important. She's, sort of like a throwaway character, in that the other characters kind of recede. So like Kuwabara, for example, recedes towards the end of the saga of the Three Kings. I, however, actually think that Keiko is important, and also Kuwabara for that matter. I think she's integral to the character development of Yusuke in terms of his ability to establish relationships with other people. Because if you remember, Yusuke Urameshi has some abandonment issues when the series begins. His father's not around, his mother's an alcoholic, and she doesn't really, care for him the way she should. And also, if you remember in the Dark Tournament saga, Yusuke sort of had an emotional block that didn't allow him to access his full powers. So if you remember when Toguro pretends to kill Kuwabara, Yusuke is then finally able to access the full potential of his powers. And he's only able to do that by opening himself up to relationships with other people, and in a way making himself more vulnerable, shedding some of that, badass persona. So those are the types of, criticisms that sort of lead to Yu Yu Hakusho being underrated. And that's basically why I believe that Yu Yu Hakusho um is underrated. People, haven't watched it. Um, the thinking, or the way people, whether or not people like it or think it's a classic anime, tends to be split. So those are basically the reasons why I think it's underrated. So let me give you my theory on why Yu Yu Hakusho gets underrated. And I have like two main reasons for this. The first is Dragon Ball Z. I mean, it's pretty simple. Dragon Ball Z. If you know anything about the history of manga and sort of like when the manga comes out, um, Dragon Ball Z comes out in 1989, in May of 1989. Yu Yu Hakusho comes out in December of 1990. So what happens is, by the time Yu Yu Hakusho comes out in 1990, the Frieza arc has already begun. And so this sort of solidifies the transition from Dragon Ball to Dragon Ball Z. So like Larry said in his sort of anime favorites on Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, like Dragon Ball was a sort of, like kid-friendly adventure type shonen series. Dragon Ball Z, however, revolutionized the shonen genre. Um, it basically was, like he said, an intergalactic battle royale. And so the scope and the scale of the battles and what was at stake in the battles was worth so much more than in relation to other shonen mangas. And Dragon Ball Z was in full swing at this time, and Yu Yu Hakusho just gets completely overshadowed. I mean, whenever people think about the origins of like the modern shonen, they always locate it with the emergence of Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z. And so the huge influence of Dragon Ball Z just kind of, completely, overshadows Yu Yu Hakusho. I mean, we still recognize, and to some extent, we still recognize that Yu Yu Hakusho is a classic anime. Um, but in relation to Dragon Ball Z, like there's not even a comparison in terms of the popularity and influence that's sort of attributed to Dragon Ball Z, especially as against, Yu Yu Hakusho. So yeah, that's basically the first reason why I think that Yu Yu Hakusho is so underrated. Like, to me, I think that if there was no Dragon Ball Z, then clearly the three classic anime that would be identified as the origins of the modern shonen genre would have to be Saint Seiya, which nobody talks about Saint Seiya anymore. Like, hardly anybody ever mentions Saint Seiya. And in fact, I don't think that anybody in the anime community, like I've never seen it, they've never even mentioned Saint Seiya at all. And Saint Seiya is like, another one of those, super classic shonen anime. Berserk, which came out. So Saint Seiya comes out in '86. Berserk comes out in '88, and Berserk is, kind of popular. It's somewhat influential, but it too gets, really overshadowed by Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z. And then Yu Yu Hakusho comes out in 1990. So if I think that if Dragon Ball Z like did not exist, then we would clearly be more willing to identify, Saint Seiya, Berserk, and Yu Yu Hakusho as classic anime in the shonen genre. And because Dragon Ball Z was so influential and so hugely popular, it just, sort of overshadows the accomplishments of Yu Yu Hakusho. The second reason why I think that Yu Yu Hakusho is so underrated is simply because there's a huge generational divide that exists within the YouTube anime community, and I think in the anime community more broadly. So first, let me just give you a brief history of the origins of the modern shonen genre, and sort of, how we get the classic anime that we get today. So if anybody knows about the history of shonen, you'll know that in the 1980s, it was mostly science fiction, and in particular, it was cyberpunk. So things like Fist of the North Star, which is another classic anime, Genocyber, which is cyberpunk, um, uh, Angel Cop, which is another cyberpunk anime, Ghost in the Shell, which came out, I believe, in either 88 or 89. So it's still in that sort of 1980s block of science fiction. Of course, Akira, Cyber City, Oedo 808, Mobile Suit Gundam. Can't forget about Mobile Suit Gundam. Highly influential and popular science fiction, military science fiction anime, and also Appleseed. So that was as far back as 1980. Between 1980 and 1990, and now that I'm thinking about it, also Space Runaway Idion, which is another, to me, classic anime, which is by Yoshiyuki Tomino, which he made between the original Mobile Suit Gundam and Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam. So the 1980s was sort of populated by science fiction shonen manga, and in particular within the subgenre of the um, cyberpunk subgenre. So that was the 1980s block of science fiction and cyberpunk. However, sort of around the mid to late 1980s, there's a shift, and the shift happens in terms of scale and scope, like I said, because Dragon Ball Z becomes like an intergalactic battle royale. But also there's a shift away from science fiction is, still sort of, popular today, but there's a major shift away from science fiction and towards fantasy. So if you think about it, like I said before, Dragon Ball comes out in 84, Saint Seiya comes out in 86, Berserk comes out in 88, and Yu Yu Hakusho comes out in 1990. And so that sort of solidifies, that starts the trend, but it also solidifies the trend towards more fantasy oriented anime and manga. So what happens is there's a generational divide in that first phase with DBZ, Saint Seiya, Berserk, and Yu Yu Hakusho. That's the first phase. The second phase, however, happens between the end of 1995 and sort of comes to an end around 2001. So at the end of 1995, Neon Genesis Evangelion is released. And between 95, the end of 95 and 2001, almost all of the anime and manga that we identify as classics or as being canon come out during that space of like 5 or 6 years. So Trigun, Evangelion, Outlaw Star, Hunter x Hunter, Inuyasha, all of the big three, Full Metal Alchemist, Cowboy Bebop, and Shaman King. All of them come out between 95 and 2001. So you have the first phase that starts with DBZ and ends with Yu Yu Hakusho, and you have the second phase that starts with the release of Neon Genesis Evangelion up to 2000, sort of 2001. So most people nowadays tend to identify the second phase, starting with the release of Neon Genesis Evangelion, as the sort of classic anime and manga, as the sort of they identify it as the most influential or the most popular period in terms of the release of classic anime and manga. And so what happens is when people do go back far enough to like the 1980s and like the early 1990s, the only thing that they tend to bring back as a classic anime and manga is Dragon Ball Z. And so everything gets overshadowed, not just because, Dragon Ball Z was so influential and so popular, but it also gets overshadowed because the second phase, which I would call like the golden age of anime and manga between 95 and 2001, just sort of we get inundated with all of these new anime and manga, that we identify as classics. And so stuff like Saint Seiya and Berserk and Yu Yu Hakusho just, again get sort of pushed to the back burner. And another great example of this sort of generational divide is with Gundam. This happens all the time in the Gundam community, where people of a younger generation tend to focus more on things like Gundam Wing, Gundam Seed, and Gundam Seed Destiny. But people like me, like, who are somewhat older, I'm 22 years old, I have not watched Gundam Seed, Gundam Seed Destiny. I haven't watched Mobile Fighter G Gundam or After War Gundam X. I haven't watched, I haven't even watched Gundam Zero Zero, which just recently came out. But I have watched almost every series in the UC timeline at least twice. So for me, like, it's kind of hard to relate to people of, that younger generation who don't go, back far enough to recognize that there are some, like, classics that happened that came out right alongside Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z in the late 80s and sort of the early 1990s. So yeah, the basically Yu Yu Hakusho gets overshadowed for like two reasons. Either one, people are too young to sort of remember or to sort of go back far enough to retrieve Yu Yu Hakusho as a classic anime or as a classic manga. Or what happens is the people who are old enough, some of the people who are old enough to remember it and who are able to, who have the ability to keep Yu Yu Hakusho alive as a sort of classic anime and a classic manga, they turn to sellouts. And a perfect example of this, and I'm not trying to start a flame war or anything, but I think I should address this, insofar as it pertains to the YouTube anime community more broadly. For Neverworld is a perfect example of this. Somebody who started off broad, who started off diverse, and now has really, just focused on a very narrow sliver of shonen anime and manga. And I don't know about you guys, but I find it very ironic that, in every video he has that sort of bookcase with all his manga volumes on it, and yet the only thing that he talks about nowadays is One Piece, Bleach, and Naruto. So that's basically what happened to Yu Yu Hakusho. And to me, I agree with Uber Black Man. I mean, I agree with, of course, this is a video response to Darius 19R. I agree with him that Yu Yu Hakusho is amazing and that it's underrated. But I also agree with Uber Black Man when he says that, in some respects, Yu Yu Hakusho is better than Dragon Ball Z. And I think that's particularly true because of the way Yu Yu Hakusho revolutionizes the character of the villain and the antagonist. It brings a sort of psychological and ethical complexity to these characters that had not been seen in Dragon Ball Z. In Dragon Ball Z, you get very stereotypical, very archetypical villains. You get people like Frieza who just want, power and domination, and they want to, rule the galaxy or the universe. You get people like Boo, who's just, hell bent on destruction and, basically blowing shit up. You get people like Cell, who, who wants to become perfect, who wants to become the perfect being, and so he, the only thing that motivates his actions are his desire to become perfect and his desire to, attain more power and to demonstrate that he's the perfect fighter. In Yu Yu Hakusho, it's not like that. And I can tell you this as an absolute guarantee. If we were to make a list of the top 20 best antagonists in all of shonen manga ever, since we would be top five without a doubt. I mean, the psychological complexity that Sensui that Togashi Yoshihiro displays with the character of Sensui is just unbelievable. the ethical and psychological complexity. So the chapter Black Saga, when he's, at first he sees he's supposed to be, his job as a spirit detective is to kill off these demons. And then when he sees how human beings are basically torturing demons and using them as, objects and playthings, he sort of realizes that the world is not so black and white, and that it's more ethically complex than he had initially thought. And so that in return, that sort of, ethical doubt that's introduced into his character manifests itself as a psychological fragmentation. And that's why he gets seven different characters, all with different motivations, all with different desires, and all with different personalities. Like, to my mind, I've never seen a antagonist in any shonen manga that even uh, approaches the sort of complexity of Sensui. I mean, seven different characters inside, seven different personalities inside one character, and the psychological complexity that's a result of the ethical complexity that's introduced into his character in the form of doubting, everything that he's been doing as a spirit detective. I mean, Togashi Yoshihiro revolutionizes the figure of the antagonist and the villain. And also Toguro. Again, if we were to make a list of top 20 antagonists, Toguro would be top 20. I don't think he'd be top 5, but I think he'd definitely be top 20. I mean, the fact that he, went through all of this guilt because, he wasn't able to protect his students, and his students, got killed. And the fact that he turns himself into a demon, not only because he feels guilt, but because that's how he actually believes that by becoming a demon, that he can, atone for something that he's really not responsible for. And the fact that he's turned into a demon sort of, is a symbol of how he himself becomes a monster. That his thinking, he's not a monster because, he's a demon. He's a monster because his mind and his psychology has been warped by these traumatic experiences that he's had in his past. And so in terms of just the work that was done for the protagonist and the figure of the villain in Yu Yu Hakusho, for that alone, Yu Yu Hakusho has to be counted as a classic anime and as a classic manga. So this was your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga. Just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace, and have a blessed day.